All right, welcome to installment 2 of population. This time we take a look at limits to growth of population. In this case, we just got done talking about carrying capacity, and we said carrying capacity was that balance, so when the organisms could survive at that level. And a lot of that has to do with a number of limiting factors. So what is it about the organism what does it need that it doesn't have within its environment to be able to have more survive? So a limiting factor is just an insufficient supply of a particular nutrient. Usually we're talking about something that's necessary for primary productivity, so meaning that its normal job can't be done because of it. So a limiting nutrient is an example of a more general term, which is called a limiting factor. A limiting nutrient is going to be a small factor. Sometimes limiting factors can be large, more like food. Limiting nutrient could be, an example would be oxygen, would be a nutrient, something that it absolutely needs to have. Limiting factor, something that causes population to actually decrease because there's something there that it needs that it can't have. Okay, so in addition to that, we also talk about it being density dependent or density independent. So the first one is a density dependent factor. This means that it depends on the population size. So this has to do with the fact that the number of organisms within an area makes a difference as to how these impact on it. So and if you look at these, it makes sense. Competition, that means that interaction when they're in competition for resources. Predation, that predator-prey, and parasitism, and then disease. So if you think about density dependent, so if there's lots of organisms within a specific area, competition is going to increase because they're having to fight over what they have for each other. If we're talking about predation, in a population where you have a lot of organisms in a small area, it's going to be easier for predators to attack. Parasites, same thing. They're going to find more hosts or more opportunity for hosts in a population size that has a lot of organisms. These are density dependent. In addition, that also means trees. Think about diseases. So I think about trees when I think about diseases. So if we think about populations where there's lots of trees next to each other versus trees that are spread out, think North Dakota. In North Dakota, for the most part, our trees are spread out. They don't get quite as many illnesses and sicknesses in the trees and have to get cut down as much as they do in other areas where there's a lot of trees populated together, because if there's a disease that goes through, it hits all the trees or close to all the trees in proximity. All these things happen and they change depending on what happens with the population. Other things are called density independent. Actually, let's go through these first and then we'll talk about density independent. So population with density dependent, when it gets to be to a high level, it makes it more difficult. So usually when we talk about these density dependent, when they have a higher population, it's going to hit them harder than when you have a lower population. I already kind of said that. So it doesn't affect those small scattered populations as much. As the example of that is the tree population. So competition, crowded populations, means there's more competition for those resources, food, water, space, mates, sunlight, all those pieces come into play. Competition is definitely a density dependent. Competition can be among the same species, and it can also be among different species. Remember that if it's within the same species, it's called intraspecific, meaning within the same species. Interspecific is when it's different species. Okay? Because of the differences that we're looking at, so the competition, this is actually how we get those different niches. Remember that niche we talked about, that we can only have one species can occupy a niche at one time. So because of that, they become specialized, and so therefore they have different niches that they're able to work within. Predator-prey relationships, this is regulation of population, so increase in prey also then dictates there's going to be an increase of population. This is probably the most widely used and best known mechanisms of population control. These predator-prey relationships are used in all sorts of different types of situations. We use them all the time as part of a population control when we're talking about organisms. This is why we have hunting seasons. This is actually why we reintroduce species into areas. We want to have control over what's happening with the population. So when you take a look at this graph, you can actually see, looking at wolf and moose population on an island, you can actually watch the wolf population and the moose population. The wolf is obviously the predator, the moose is obviously the prey, and in this case, as you see, when the moose population goes up, shortly after, the the wolf population also goes up. They talk about this as being kind of a chase graph is what they refer to it as, is that as one increases, the other one will shortly thereafter increase. When you see a drastic change in population, so you see an increase going on with our wolves here, something drastic had to happen to create a situation where they all crashed like this. And you can see the moose population was steadily decreasing. So the wolves probably went through a starvation period, and that made a huge crash in populations until they kind of balanced back out. And then as the moose population started to increase, here we had some great increases. The wolf population hadn't been able to rebound. And if you look at the time frame, this is in the 1990s. This is actually when the wolf hunt became really large. And so there's an increase in killing off the wolves. And so therefore, that's part of the reason that you see this great increase in moose population. So they two balance each other out. The two of them create a situation where when the wolf population decreases, the moose population is able to increase. So it ends up being able to be a balance between the two that we end up seeing happening. The other one is parasitism. We talked about parasitism and disease. Oftentimes limit population growth because it actually does harm organisms. Disease can definitely be another factor in that as well. Population size doesn't really matter in the next grouping, which is called density dependent. Density independent limiting factors, they're going to affect all populations the same way. They don't care if there's a lot of organisms within the population, or if it's a scattered population, if it's a small population. Population size doesn't matter. So things that are density independent limiting factors, unusual weather. So if there's a drought, that affects all organisms. It doesn't matter if it is in small populations or large populations. It doesn't really matter. That unusual weather, that drought, will create a situation where all populations exist. Natural disasters, fires is a great example of this. When you see fires come through, it affects all populations. It doesn't matter if you're thick populations or thin populations. If you're talking about that you're compacted, whether you're spread out, it doesn't really matter at all. Seasonal cycles also affect all organisms, all populations. So as you have the ebb and flow in the temperature, it makes a big difference as well. Human activities also play a role in this too. Some of those human activities change the environment, and all those changes don't really care if the organism is, if it's a density, if the population is compact, or whether the population is sparse. Makes no difference one way or the other. Alright, so this wraps us up. We're done talking about our density factors, really looking at the idea of how population grows, factors that increase or decrease population. So our big ones, as wrap up, just to make sure that you get these. We talk about limiting factors, and those limiting factors come in two different major forms. Density dependent, which means it's completely dependent on the populations, and density independent, meaning that it affects populations the same whether they're large populations or not. Okay, good luck!